Throughout history, few punishments have embodied the brutal and symbolic authority of the state as vividly as quartering. Often combined with hanging and disembowelment, quartering was designed not merely to kill, but to annihilate the traitor's body, destroying their legacy, and then to deliver a terrifying warning to the public. It was a slow, painful, humiliating method of execution used mostly in medieval and early modern Europe, especially in England. Though the phrase hung, drawn and quartered is widely known, the actual reality of quartering is far worse than most people today imagine. In this video, we explore the grisly mechanics of quartering, the historical context of its use, and look at several disturbing real-life examples to show how this punishment was not just fatal, it was a form of state-orchestrated torture. To support our channel, please click subscribe. Quartering in its full form was typically part of the execution for high treason in medieval and Tudor England. It was not a single act, but a sequence of brutal steps. The condemned man, and it was nearly always a man, was first dragged onto a wooden hurdle or sledge through the streets of the place of execution. This was the drawing. Then he was hanged until nearly dead, half hanged, before being cut down while still conscious. Some also had to be revived. Next came the most horrifying phase, disembowelment and castration, often performed while the victim was very much still alive. The executioner would open the abdomen, remove the intestines, cut off the genitals, and burn them in front of the victim. Only then would he be beheaded, and finally his body cut into 4 pieces, quartered. These quarters were then displayed on city gates, bridges, or sent to other parts of the kingdom as a warning to others. Trust the English to be the most brutal. Quartering wasn't just a punishment, it was a state ritual designed to demonstrate the overwhelming power of the monarchy. It symbolically tore the traitor apart, just as he had supposedly tried to tear apart the realm through rebellion. This made it especially common for those convicted of high treason, which was seen not merely as a crime, but as a personal attack on the very body of the king or queen and their role. The method also served a psychological purpose. Public executions were theatrical, and quartering was the ultimate in gruesome spectacle. Crowds would gather, sometimes numbering in the thousands, to watch every stage of the process. It was intended to terrify onlookers, discourage rebellion, and reinforce the idea that the monarch, the king or queen's justice was absolute. The punishment of being hanged, drawn and quartered was enshrined in English law by the time of King Edward I in the late 13th century. It became especially prominent during the reigns of Edward III and Henry VIII. Under these monarchs, the definition of treason expanded, and so did the list of victims. Political opponents, rebels, Catholic priests, and even innocent scapegoats found themselves sentenced to this horrific death. Women were technically not subjected to quartering, at least not in the full sense. Because of perceived modesty and decorum, women convicted of treason were instead burned at the stake, a punishment hardly less cruel. One of the earliest and most famous examples of quartering was William Wallace, the Scottish knight and resistance leader. After his capture in 1305, Wallace was brought to London, where he was hanged, drawn and quartered for treason against King Edward I. His head was placed on London Bridge, and his limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth. Wallace was a symbol of Scottish resistance, and his dismembered body became a symbol of England's vengeance. Another famous example and case is Guy Fawkes, involved in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Although he was set to be quartered like his fellow conspirators, Fawkes actually cheated the scaffold, sort of. He jumped from the gallows during the hanging stage and broke his neck, dying instantly. His body was still quartered, however his remains were sent all across the kingdom. Thomas Armstrong, a royalist supporter during the exclusion crisis in 1684, was another particularly gruesome example. His execution was carried out with such brutality that witnesses were shocked. His body was dismembered with apparent relish by the executioner, and parts were then sent to various cities to rot in public view. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of quartering was its use against those whose guilt was, at times, questionable or at least politically motivated. Father Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest, was executed in 1581, not for plotting treason, but for simply being a Catholic in Protestant England. His execution, which included disembowelment while alive, was carried out at Tyburn in front of an absolutely huge crowd. According to eyewitnesses, Campion bore his torture with saintly composure. One of the many horrors of quartering is that in some cases, the victim often remained alive well into the mutilation. Contemporary executioners were not always skilled or humane. Accounts describe men screaming while their entrails were burned before them, or gasping as their limbs were hacked from their torso. The smell, the sounds, and the spectacle were all part of the experience, designed to burn the lesson of loyalty into the minds of the crowd. For instance, the execution of David Tyree, a Scottish man executed in 1782 for passing naval secrets to the French, was so disturbing that the crowd turned away in revulsion. His heart, held aloft by the executioner, was meant to be part of the ritual declaration, "Behold the heart of a traitor," but the crowd groaned and booed, appalled by the sheer cruelty. This event is often cited as a turning point in public opinion about such brutal punishments. By the late 18th century, sensibilities were beginning to change. The Enlightenment had brought about new ideas about justice, human dignity, and also the limits of state power. Though the laws still technically allowed quartering, the practice began to fall out of favour. The last recorded sentence of hanging, drawing and quartering in Britain was in 1803, though by then the process had become largely symbolic. Victims were usually hanged until dead and only then mutilated. By 1870, the punishment was formally abolished by law. Quartering was not just execution, it was a message in flesh. It was a gruesome performance meant to horrify and warn. The victims were not only killed, they were dismantled, erased, and displayed. The cruelty lay not only in the pain inflicted, but in the deliberate, ritualistic nature of punishment. It was state-sanctioned acts of terror, and one that reveals the extremes of authoritarian control in medieval and early modern Europe. Today, hung, drawn and quartered is often said with a kind of historical detachment, as if it was a phrase from a Shakespeare play, but the reality was far bloodier, more agonising, and more calculated than most people realise. It was a fate worse than death. It was dismemberment of the body and identity, broadcast as public entertainment, in the name of justice. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to click subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.